The biggest species of fish available to coarse anglers across most of the UK is the carp. Regularly targeted by match participants for its winning weights, it has a strong following in its own right, with dedicated enthusiasts often bivvied up for days on end in the hope of catching wily and elusive 40-pound plus examples. This programme is designed to help coarse anglers who contact this beautiful fish, usually on pole or rod and line techniques, consider the merits of committing to a more dedicated species approach with multiple rods, pods and all the added gizmos and paraphernalia associated with carp fishing. The best man to enlighten us in this arena is Julian Cundiffe, he of much hair and indeed much carp wisdom. Let's join this famous carp angler for an hour or so and get good guidance on carp fishing for coarse anglers.
The rods are out, the baits are in position, the end tackles are absolutely spot on, the presentation is about as good as I can think of doing it at the moment, and things look good for a fish. Now you'll be looking at this thinking, it's alright for Jules, he's been fishing for years, he knows exactly what to do, he knows the best rigs, he knows the best baits, he even goes to the best venues. It's not true. The last thing you want to do is fish with a bait which the carp can take or leave, so always make sure the bait is as attractive as possible and the rig to a certain extent will take care of itself. So what do we mean when we talk of the term carp rig? People glibly talk about carp rigs as though it could be anything. Are they talking about the lead? Are they talking about the tubing? The hook? The hair? Or what? There are so many different pieces that you have in your tackle box, and there's so many different pieces that go to make a carp rig. There are two types of end tackle that are normally used. There's a helicopter rig here and there's the inline rig here. To start with, we'll look at the helicopter rig. This is this one here. The helicopter rig is so called because it's at one end is your lead and there's a swivel here which can go around in a circle, giving the helicopter effect. This is what you would use on a gravel pit. If you think about this, when you're casting out, your lead goes first, your swivel's here and your hook link's off here. That will hit the gravel, but your swivel and your hook link will be protected, and this is commonly used in gravel pits. The second of our rigs is what is known as an inline rig, and it's known as an inline rig because the line goes straight from the angler straight through to the swivel, in line. As you can see there, you've got the lead, the anti-tangle tubing and the swivel there. The angler has a direct pull from one end to the fish. This is the kind of setup that you would use for fishing in weed. No matter where you fish for carp, sooner or later you're going to come across a water where weed is present. More and more waters are starting to develop areas of weed. Whilst at times it can make your fishing harder, the weed has many advantages. Firstly, waters with lots of weed are usually very rich in natural food. This makes the carp bigger, of course. Secondly, because carp are somewhat of a predictable fish, I can almost guarantee that where you find weed, you will find the carp. That makes location a lot easier. However, unlike gravel pits, where you can cast out and know your presentation isn't hidden, in weedy waters, there's always a chance that your bait may be hidden in the weed out of view from the carp, unless you get your location and rigs correct. Also, when fishing in and around the weed, you have to be very positive in your actions, and if you're not careful, the carp will weed you up. So as you can see, weed has both advantages and disadvantages. I'm sure with the advice contained here and a little bit of your own thoughts, we can solve it together. As far as I'm concerned, carp learn by association, and when they've been caught a number of times, be it on a bait, an end tackle or a presentation, they will start to learn. And if you've ever actually seen a lead drop through the water, it goes through the water like that, it hits the floor, and your hook link naturally follows it down as so, and will almost inevitably end up next to your lead. Now when the carp haven't been caught very many times, this won't make a difference, but after the carp have been caught a number of times, eventually you will have a lead like that with a hook next to it like that, and eventually the carp will start to scare off that. What you need to do is make your end tackle as subtle or as camouflaged as possible, and so I try always, no matter where I'm fishing, to camouflage my lead, be it green or brown or mottled, to match the lake bed exactly. Sometimes I'm fishing in weed, sometimes I'm fishing in silt, and sometimes I'm fishing in mud. So I obviously pick a colour that matches the lake bed. It might not catch you many extra carp a year, but even if it only catches you one or two of the cutest carp or the wary carp, and they're often the big ones, it's worth persevering with. So how do you go from that standard lead, as it appears in most tackle shops, to that lead there, which is a kind of lead, the kind of end tackle that I would ask you to use in your presentations? Well, it's actually quite easy. You can actually coat leads by using something that Terry Eustace and quite a few other tackle dealers have, and that's called the lead coating paint. This is quite an easy process, but it's one I've yet to get right. You heat your lead up as much as possible, and when it's heated up, you add the lead coating to it, and then that sets over it, giving it a lovely mottled effect. Well, unfortunately, I've tried this time and time and time again, and all I end up doing is melting the lead and ending up with a real mess. So I myself have come up with a special way that is far better, with its simplicity itself. All you need to do is paint your leads to match the colour of the lake bed. The paint itself is available from any model shop, certainly Woolworths sell them, so you have 2 tins of paint there. Now there are certain elements that appear in all presentations. Firstly, there is the hook. All carp presentations, no matter what they are, entail the use of a hook. Now just like boilies, just like floats and just like cars, everyone's got their own favourite carp hook. I tend to use 2 kind of carp hooks. One is the Partridge Z2 record breaker hooks, and the second one are the Drennan Super Specimens. If I'm using a small boilie, say 14mm or a 16mm or something of that size, then I will use the Drennan Super Specimen hooks. If I'm using a bigger bait, or if I'm using a double boilie, I'll use the Partridge Z2 hooks. These Z2 hooks have a slightly wider gape to them, and they're better for hooking. But really, if you just kept to those 2 hooks for the rest of your carp fishing, you wouldn't have any problems at all. If you're fishing a standard bottom bait and you're fishing in weed, then sometimes your boilie can get stuck in the weed on the bottom of the lake. To avoid that, you use a pop-up boilie so it hangs in the water like that. And the good thing about this is that you can actually fish it any distance above. I've set that about 1 inch. You can have it 6 inches, 1/4 of an inch, or however deep you wish to set it. Very, very easy. Use exactly the same hook link as a standard bottom bait, and all that you're doing is using a pop-up, which is a buoyant bait, and using a split shot to hold it down at the required depth. And that puts that bait on view to the carp, very easy for the carp to find, and that's your standard pop-up. And the final presentation, again, it is a pop-up presentation, as you can see here. On a first examination, you're probably thinking it's exactly the same as the other presentations. It's a standard pop-up, and it's either critically balanced or overshotted. But what we've done here is we've coated the last 1.5 inches in Hawser, and that's the rigid stiffener by Christen. You don't actually need to use this, you can actually use super glue. And the reason why we do this is for one of 2 reasons. Firstly, when carp have been caught time and time on pop-up presentations, they do get a little bit wary of them. They will suck the presentation in, and because the braid is so supple, what gets sucked in easily can also get blown out easily. So to improve that presentation, you coat the last 1.5 inches in this super glue. The carp sucks the presentation in, and because it's stiff and can't crumple up like a normal braid, the carp tries to blow it out and it catches in its mouth. See the difference there? That's a stiffness and that's a supple braid. That can easily be blown out, whereas that which is stiff can't be blown out half as easy. And that's a very, very good way of making a pop-up even more effective. 1.5 inches of residence there. You can actually enlarge that to 3 inches or 4 inches, but I found about 1.5 inches is enough to fool any carp. For the purposes of summer fishing, I use a big fish mix. That's a fish meal. Now there can't be many people in carp fishing today who haven't heard about fish meals. They are very, very popular indeed. In fact, most people who are interested in carp fishing have heard of fish meals. You know they catch your carp and they are an excellent bait. But that's not the only carp bait to use. The other carp bait that I'm going to recommend is the bird seed. Now there are two types of bird seed bases. One is the red spicy base mix and one is the yellow plain base mix. Now the problem with the red spicy baits is that for every water they work well, there's always one water that they don't work quite as well. So I wouldn't advise you to use red bird foods to start with. What I would draw your attention to is the plain yellow bird seed. There can't be many of you who haven't heard of the famous strawberry cream combination. This in fact is a combination I've been using since 1988, and that is a proof of a good bait. Never mind all this talk about baits which are brilliant one year and not brilliant another year. What you want is a bait that works year in, year out. And I can assure you that the combination I have in front of me here today is a combination that I've been using for the last 6 years. And that is the true test of a good bait. And it's such a good bait that I know that when people write to me and when you watch these films, that if you copy this bait exactly, this will catch your carp. And that's what I want you to do. So what I'm going to do today is concentrate purely and simply on making up the yellow bird seed bait. Making up baits is no problem at all, and the same process that we use for the yellow bird seed we can actually use for making up fish meal baits. It doesn't differ at all, but rather than complicate the issue by making up two types of baits, we're just going to make one kind of boilie. Very, very easy indeed. First thing is make sure you are in a place which is cool and comfortable. Today I'm making baits in my kitchen, but normally I make them in the garage. Wherever you are, make sure you're not going to be disturbed, because the worst thing that could happen is the phone going, somebody wanting to make a cup of coffee, things like that, because it's all a disturbance and you probably end up rushing your bait and making a right mess of it. And there's nothing more guaranteed to put you off for life than having the first few mixes go completely wrong. So follow this process and you'll be spot on, no problems at all. First thing we need to do is make sure you've got enough of all the flavours, enough eggs and enough base mix. So if you've only got a half full bottle of flavour, then don't even try and do it. Make sure you've got at least 3/4 full bottles, make sure you've got enough colour and make sure you've got enough of the enhancers. It's no good finding that you've got 3 of one thing and not enough of another, because that can ruin the whole base mix. So do ensure that you've got everything to hand. First of all, crack the 6 eggs in the bowl like that. When you've done that, beat the eggs up. Now some people do in fact use a blender. In fact, I've found that a blender can put too much air into the eggs, and that actually can cause your bait to float. So just using a fork, and when I talk about a fork, I mean a sturdy fork. Don't just use one of these flimsy forks that bends as soon as you do that, because it's very easy to whisk the eggs with a fork like this, but once you start trying to mix the paste as well with a flimsy fork, it'll go right to cock, so don't worry about that. Now it's time to add the flavours. As you can remember from our earlier recipe, we're using 2 mils of the strawberry, and I'm using a standard pipette here, and it's marked up to 3 mils. All you do is squeeze the end in tightly into the bottle, and it'll suck the flavour up. Just squeeze out the excess flavour that you don't need till it's down to 2 mils, and then into the bowl like that. So 2 mils of strawberry, and 3 mils of the cream. Just one little point as well, always put the tops back on bottles, because there's nothing more guaranteed that when you reach for something you'll knock a full bottle of flavour over, and that can ruin your bait making for the night. 6 drops of the bergamot oil. Now these actually come with their own dropper, so you don't need to get a separate dropper. Be very careful when you add this, single droplets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's no need to whisk the eggs just yet. The final 2 additives are powders. Now some people say you don't have to add powders at this stage, you should add the powders to the base mix. I don't like doing it that way, I actually like to add them to the eggs. We're using a level teaspoonful of Milk B Plus. Again, this one though does want whisking in, otherwise it gathers on the top. When you've beaten it, just check inside the bowl and make sure none of the Milk B has gathered round the bowl, because if it's gathered round the side of the bowls, it won't actually be in the recipe. So if there's none left, then go to your colours. Now I've got 3 colours on display here today. We've got the yellow, the orange and the red. And with this kind of bait, you're trying to make it as visual as possible, so you want a strong colour. Personally, I prefer yellow, though some people prefer red or orange. Be very, very careful with these colours, because you only need a very small amount to produce a bright bait. In time, you'll soon realise how much colour you need. If you can just see, you only need a very, very small bit of it. And that's enough, no more than that. Again, whisk this slowly. If you whisk it too fast, it will actually end up around the edges of the bowl. Do it nice and slowly, and you can see the colour taking effect. A nice bright yellow colour, and again look around the edges of the bowl and make sure there's no residue left. If you want a stronger bait colour, then just add more yellow. Do remember that the bait ingredients, in this case the Enovite Gold, will slightly taint your bait, but because it's a light coloured bait, it won't taint it too much. So you've done that, give it a final whisk around to make sure it's all mixed. And we're now ready to add the base mix to the liquids. Now you'll see in the recipes I've actually said that you need to add 16 or 18 ounces of Enovite Gold. Well, don't worry, you don't actually need to weigh out 16 or 18 ounces of Enovite Gold. All you need to do is add just enough to make a firm paste. The days of adding 4 ounces of this and 2 ounces of that are well gone. All you do is add enough base mix to make a firm paste, and that's what I'll do now. Now you can actually add it by hand, but I prefer to put it into something like that, and don't add too much at a time, just add a small bit like that. As you can see, the liquid will start to merge with the base mix. Makes a nice sloppy mess. Now if you add too much at this stage, all that will happen will be the base mix goes into big blobs, and that is not what you want. So get the initial base mix in it like that. Each time that I'm adding base mix to it, I'm adding probably about 1/2 to 3/4 of a pint of base mix, but I can assure you that as you become more proficient in bait making, you don't need to worry about that. It'll be second nature. Again, you can see the mix is now starting to firm up a bit more. Still nice and moist, which is what you want it to do. Keep adding that base mix. You see that I've used a large bowl. If you use too small a bowl, you'll find that you won't get 6 eggs worth of attractors, eggs and also base mix in it. See how now it's starting to firm up? And again, if you've got too flimsy a fork, it won't cut through this. Now at this stage, keep it very, very light indeed, because too much at this stage will ruin your base mix totally. See how it's getting harder to add? The moisture's been absorbed up and it's getting stickier and stickier. This is a stage when people tend to panic. Don't panic, it's still going well. We're almost at the stage where we're actually going to use our hands. Just a little bit more base mix. And that should suffice. As you can see now, it's virtually impossible to move the fork round. All the moisture's been taken up and we can actually use this by hand. As you can see, with your hands, you can sort of gather it up. As you can see from the bowl, all the dry mix has now been absorbed. Well, almost all of it has been absorbed. You can't get any more into that at all. And if you actually look at the consistency of this, this is now ready for rolling. Now people will be saying to themselves, well, how do I know that's ready for rolling? A little tip I can give you is just break a little piece off in your hand, put it in your palm like that, and roll it in a circle. That makes a bait like that. That is perfect. If the bait goes like that, a bit like a peanut shape, then it's not firm enough. And if it starts to split, it's too dry. But I can assure you that at this stage, this is ready to make into the sausages. Now the problem about working at home is that your base mix can dry up. Once this starts to dry up, then you'll find you can't make the sausages. So the best thing you can do is put it into a plastic bag. Now I use standard freezer bags. See that? Don't be tempted to use cheap freezer bags. This is a good quality freezer bag. This keeps the moisture inside here and stops the bait drying out. Having made the bowl of paste and put it inside the plastic bag, we now need to get rid of all the ingredients and put them out the way, because you're going to need a little bit of space to roll the sausages on. So let's just get those out of the way. Right. As you can see, this is a Formica, which is what I roll my baits on. You've got to be very careful about what you actually roll the sausages on. We're actually going to use what is known as the Gardner or the Kingfisher rolling table. The days of actually having to roll baits by hand are long gone. You don't need to do that at all. We're actually going to use a roller ball maker. What it requires is you first, just to break off a bit of the paste like that, a little handful like that. Just roll it a little bit by hand to get the sausage started, and then pick whatever size of roller ball you want. As you can see. And there's your sausage formed perfectly. Roll the ball down, chop the excess sausage off, and there you have the first sausage made. Now I'm not going to bore you by showing you how to make 20 sausages. I'll just show you how to make one more. Again, time will tell you how much you need to break off each time. A little bit down, roll by hand, excess cut off as so. Perfect. I've now got 2 sausages there. I'm going to spend some time rolling up the rest of the sausages, about half a dozen more. Now this is the other part of the roller ball maker. This is actually what makes your round boilies. Now some people advise you to lay 3 sausages along the boilie maker like that. That's not what I'd advise you to do. When you do it like that, the boilies these can actually roll together, touch and stick, and you end up with the right mess. So what I would advise you to do is just to make 1 set at a time. Lay it along there, nice and smoothly. That's your top. On the top, firm hand pressure, probably about a dozen times. Lift up, and as you can see, homemade baits, just as good as ready-made and ready for the carp to feed on. Having made your baits, it's now a question of boiling them and putting a skin on them. You can actually use your baits without boiling them and use them as a paste bait, but for 95%, probably 99% of carp fishing purposes, we want to use them as boilies, which means we boil them. First of all, bring your water to the boil. When it is boiling, put in a colander or a sieve, because that's going to allow you to lift your boilies out, and then add your baits to them. Don't add too many boilies, or you will find that with the boilies being cold and the water being hot, the temperature will drop and the baits won't boil properly. This recipe that I'm using here, there's a boiling time recommended of 75 seconds. One thing I would say is that as the baits are being boiled, just give them a stir round like that, and that stops them sticking together. As I said, these baits need boiling for 75 seconds, other baits need boiling for a little longer than that. Some baits have to be boiled for 2 minutes. The recipes I've given you today require a boiling time of 75 seconds. That's the fish meals and the bird seeds. But protein baits, they don't take boiling so well, and they're only boiled for 60 seconds or so. Looking at the clock, 50 seconds have elapsed, so we're well on the way now. As you can see now, the baits with the boiling are starting to rise. The warm temperature's made them rise a little, as you can see there, up to 60 seconds, and they're getting lighter and lighter. Don't worry about this, because when they have cooled down, they'll sink perfectly. 70 seconds, you must not exceed the boiling limit, 74, 75. 75 seconds is up, shake off the excess water, move the tray out of the way, and just shake those on there. What you need to do as well is to make sure that they dry properly. Just swirl them around in your hands. As you can see, the baits are starting to cool. The steam's coming off them and they're starting to harden nicely. Now obviously I'm not going to boil up 200 or 300 baits, because that would waste too much of your time. I'm just going to show you how to make these. As those are cooling, you could go back and boil some more baits until you've boiled the whole mix. Whilst I will be covering the use of pop-up presentation in the rig segment of the videos, I think it's only right that at this stage I explain to you a little bit about how to make pop-ups. It's just like making boilies. Some people are very confused about it, and there really is no need to be. I've heard talk of microwaving, polyboiling, cork boiling, and it can get very confusing. What a pop-up is a boilie that you can actually add to a hook, and it can be suspended off the bottom whereby the carp can find it and it's easy to hook them. Now how do you make a pop-up boilie? Well, obviously boilies don't float, because if they floated the carp would never find them. So you have to make your boilie pop up some way, and the way we do that is by adding either polystyrene or cork balls. Now it would be very easy if we could actually just push the polystyrene or the cork inside your standard mix. The problem with when you're using things like bird seeds or fish meals is the actual dry ingredients are very coarse, and because they're coarse they let the flavours out, and because the flavours can leak out, as well as the flavours leaking out, the water can leak in, and a pop-up which was presented off the bottom can absorb the water and sink to the bottom. So what we need to do is prepare a pop-up that it is very similar to our actually standard boilie, but doesn't take in water. The way to do that is to compromise, and that's to use 50% of your normal base mix, which in our case is the Enovite Gold birdseed, and 50% of the protein mix. As you can see, protein powders are very fine, and when you make a boilie consisting of a protein powder, the skin on the outside is very tight and doesn't let in water. So what we need to do is compromise, and what you need to do is just add 50% of each. Make sure it's exactly the same quantities. What I'm using here is 1/4 pint of Enovite Gold, and 1/4 pint of Nutribait's High Noval. Now Nutribait's High Noval is a protein mix, and Rod Hutchinson's got one, Cotswold Baits have got one, Premier have got one, Kevin Nash have got one. And these mixes, you add them together like that, inflate the bag, swirl it round until the two powders are mixed evenly. So you've got a very, very similar kind of base mix to your original one which you made your boilies out of, but it's a little tighter in the skin to make the pop-ups out of. You then just add this to your eggs and make it as a normal bait. You'll find that the skin produced is a little bit tighter. Having made the paste, which you'll find is a little bit firmer than the standard paste, you just need to break off little ball-sized segments. When you get it, just make a similar sized ball as you would want your pop-up to be. Flatten it down. Then get either a polystyrene or a cork ball pop-up. Flatten it nice and smooth, poly ball in the middle, wrap the paste securely around it, and roll. And that's a poly ball pop-up. Now the next thing to do is, well, after you've made all your baits, make about, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 dozen pop-ups, boil them for the standard period, and what I do to make them a little bit harder is I allow them to dry overnight. And because you're giving them 12 hours to dry rather than the standard 3 hours, it makes them even harder and they're less likely to take in water. And as you see later in the rig segment, these are a very, very effective way of catching carp. Standard polyballed pop-up. Now no matter how good your bait is, and you'll be catapulting these out in the water, what you've got to do is make sure that the carp picks it up into its mouth. Now we all know carp are stimulated by the flavours and by the attraction. The problem is, of course, is that your hook bait is just one of 50 or 100 or 1,000 baits out there. How do you make it more attractive than the standard free bait? Well, I've come up with a little idea and a little process which I've called the over flavouring of hook baits. If you remember back to our original mix, we used these flavours, and you remember that combination, and we used 6 eggs. Now what we can do, instead of using 6 eggs and those flavours, we can just use 3 eggs and those flavours. And of course what that will do with, it will give us twice as much smell, and that will mean they're over flavoured. So we're just using the 3 eggs but the same amount of flavouring. Again, 3 eggs in the pan, normal flavours, and add your base mix. And of course I must emphasise this is only to be used with hook baits. If you were to use it with your normal standard baits, then of course there would be no advantage and the flavour would be too strong for the carp. Because you're just using it in single baits, the ones with a hook, that'll attract the carp to that single bait and you get more of a chance of a pickup. It's a good little idea and it'll certainly catch you a lot more carp, certainly in winter and probably in summer as well, so don't forget it. Having given your standard bottom baits, your freebies, 3 hours to dry, and given your pop-ups and your over-flavoured hook baits a night to dry, and of course you need to freeze them. Now if you're going to use them the same day, there's no need to freeze them at all, just take them down to the lake. But if you're going to use them in the next week or the next month, then obviously you've got to freeze them because otherwise they'll go off. So just put them in a bag like that. Normally I would probably put 2 or 3 pounds in a bag like this, take them to the freezer and pop them in the freezer. Right, time to get the show on the road. I've just had a hard day at work and it's time to get fishing. I do try to take the minimum amount of tackle with me for these short sessions. In effect, I've got 12 hours of carp fishing. The last thing I want to be doing is lumbering around with gas bottles, televisions, bait buckets. Everything that I carry, that I put in the cart, I can carry around the lake in one go. No messing about with lots of different little buckets. It's all in those 5 bags. Right, let's see if we can go catch a carp. Now, the thing about carp fishing is that most people get in the car, get down to the lake and start thinking about the fishing then. That's much too late. First of all, I've contacted the weather forecast and they've told me it's going to be a hot evening. It's going to be red hot tonight, so that tells me something about where I'm going to fish. I've had a walk around the lake the day before and there's just odd anglers fishing. Nobody seems to have caught much, so it's obviously the carp are still spawning. They're not really feeding very heavily. All this gives me some idea about where I'm going to fish to start with. There's nothing wrong with thinking about where you're going to fish in advance, as long as you don't have any predetermined ideas about where and when you're going to fish. I like to have at least some idea about where I'm going to fish. I don't like to think I'm going to fish such and such a swim definitely, but it's good if you can get to the water and think, well, conditions as I expected, angler pressure as I expected, that's where I'm going to fish. Often you don't have an hour to walk around the water and you've got to make your decision there and then, so at least think about it in advance. Think about it while you're home, think about it in the evening, think about it at work, and I guarantee you'll catch more carp thinking about it. Right, let's get a carp caught. Right, I'm at the water now. I never mind the car journey to the water, whether it's 5 minutes or 5 hours. It gives me a chance to get the old carp brain into gear. At home I may have 1,001 things to do, 1,001 things I haven't done, and yet on the road I can actually start to click into gear. I'm thinking about what I've got to do. Where will other anglers be? How many other anglers there will be here? Which way will the wind be blowing? What have the other anglers done? How much bait have they put in? It's all going into my brain. You can't just turn up at a water and think, I'll start thinking about my carp fishing now. That's far too late. You've got to use the journey for a good purpose. So even if you're stuck in traffic, keep thinking about what you're doing, about where you're going to fish. Don't make a definite decision about where you're going to fish. That's silly. The fish may have been there last week. They probably won't be there this week. They may be, you may be lucky. But don't make that decision until you get to the lake. I know some of the lakes are very crowded and it's tempting to get into your first swim, but that's not the way to do it. As soon as you turn up at the lake, probably the best thing you can do is go and ask other anglers if they've caught any fish. Usually, if you've been a good angler yourself and helped other anglers out, they'll help you out. You'll notice the dark clothing that I've got on. Now, a lot of you prefer to wear the more outrageous things, the LA boots, the Puma boots, the bright t-shirts. Now really, that's silly at this day and age. You're going to be looking in the edges, you'll be climbing trees, and you'll be stood looking out over fish. If you wear bright clothes, I'm not saying bright colours will scare fish, but when you move, that contrast will scare the fish. So I prefer to wear the dark coloured clothes. I also have a lot of spare clothes in the car. I'm well known for falling in the water or going in for weeded fish, especially in the summer, so I've got to have the spare clothes in the car. There's no point in going after a fish, getting completely wet through and thinking, I haven't got any spare clothes with me. Straight back to the car, new clothes, recast. Saves having to drive an hour home. As you can see, I've got the white bucket with me to mark my spot. There's no point walking round and choosing a swim and then finding that you've got to go back to the car for your tackle and then you've got nothing to mark your swim. It's well known in carp fishing that leaving a bucket or a water bottle in your swim will mark that area. It also comes in quite handy for sitting and watching the water. Now let's have a look at a couple of these swims and see what the advantages and disadvantages are. The one thing about carp location is they've got to be here when I'm fishing. It's no good if these carp are going to be here tomorrow. I'm restricted to fishing between 6 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning. If those fish are going to be here in the day, that's a waste of time. Just think about when you're fishing. Don't just jump into the obvious hot spots. When are you fishing? What hours are you fishing? How much bait can you put in? You've got to pick a swim that's best for you and not best for the bloke who's a 3-day carp angler. Most carp waters will have swims that are fished day in, day out, day in, day out. It's very tempting to jump into that swim because it's a proven swim. But think about your fishing. Are you going to be here when the carp are picking the baits up? If the carp are picking the baits up at night time and you can only fish evenings, it's a waste of time. So I need to pick a swim where the fish are definitely going to be here during my stay. Now, it's all right walking around the lake with your binoculars and your sunglasses, but you need to get to a certain height to actually look down into the lake. This is one of the 3 lakes' climbing trees. You can make good advantage of these by going up them. Let's see if I can get up this one. Knew that bucket would come in useful. Now, one thing I should say to all you carp anglers out there, never ever climb trees unless you're particularly adept at doing it. A tree will give you an excellent vantage point, as this does. But I've seen people fall out of trees and injure themselves. If you're a youngster, if you may be overweight, or if you're not a good tree climber, don't climb up a tree. If you're any good at climbing trees, they are very, very useful. From up here I can actually look down into the water, and using my binoculars I can actually see quite a few carp bubbling round the island. Now, it's not from this swim that I'm going to fish it. I'll have to try and fish it from another swim. With the sun high in the sky, it's only late afternoon, but it's actually lighting the water up. I can actually see into the water. I can see fish now that literally I was only stood feet from and I couldn't see. So make use of any climbing trees if you can find them. Right, let's have a little bit further. This certainly looks a good spot. In fact, it looks a very good spot. Problem is, somebody else has been here before me. There's quite a few carp just there on the surface. You can see. Problem is, they're only small fish, those. Looks like they're spawning as well. That can be a problem, is that what are feeding fish and what are spawning fish. Certainly looks a good area. Yeah, you can just see them bubbling away. There's probably about 20 or 30 carp, some into the doubles, the odd one or two just mooch around in this corner that are probably low 20s. The only thing that worries me about this swim is if we get a strong wind, it might push the fish through into the other lake. But bearing in mind I've seen very little fish action anywhere else, I'm only here for the night, so if I make a mistake, it's only costing me 12 hours fishing. I think this is a spot to be in. Well, I'll live all four by that decision. Let's go get the tackle. I know people think I've got an easy time of it just doing these overnighters, but when you do 4 or 5 of these a week, you're absolutely exhausted by the time you get to the swim. I know I am. I certainly need a drink of something. And the problem is that many people, when they get to the swims, the last thing they want to do is settle down and think about the fishing. Now that's a mistake. All you're thinking about when you're on your way here is how soon am I going to get to the swim. The last thing you've got is your carp brain in gear. If I possibly can, I always like to spend 5 or 10 minutes just looking at the water and thinking about what I'm going to do. There's no point me leading everywhere, otherwise I'm wasting time. I certainly can't put a bait in every single position. Let's start off by leading against the far weed bed. Simple cast. Felt the lead thump the bottom. Now what you do, turn the bail arm over, feel the rod tighten up to it. What you're doing is drawing that lead back along the bottom. You can feel that inching, pulled into a bit of weed, clear spot. When the weed is very thick, you will not be able to move the rod back at all. It's not too bad at all there. You can feel the lead jarring in the weed, gone solid there. What that tells me is that tight against the weed it's clear, a rod length off the weed I'm into solid weed. I'm going to have to be very careful then when I'm casting out. I've got to drop tight against the weed. You see here, lead dropping down. You're using your hands, the rod tip and the line to tell you what's on the bottom. If you look at the floor here, grass, dirt, debris. I don't want my indicators to get caught in that, so I use what is known as a rod mat. You actually can't buy these anymore, but you can certainly make them easily enough. All you need, thick piece of carpet or whatever, little clip in each corner and a turned down tent peg. Now I know quite a few people laugh at this when they see it. When you think about it, what a jolly good idea. When that's down there, pegged in securely, then there's no way dirt can splash up onto your indicators, your visual swingers. Absolutely brilliant. So few people use these, and yet it'll actually cost you fish. If your indicator system gets covered in grime or this gets solid and won't move, then you'll miss a take and you could lose your rod. So make one of these, very easy. As you can see, I put out my third and final bait for the night. I felt it hit the bottom, so it's in the right place. I've tightened up by hand to the lead, but the last thing I want to do is move that lead. So the first thing I do is undo my clutch. This means I can pay line off the bait runner. You could of course click on your bait runner facility, but I don't use that. I'm using the clutch. So paying line off the clutch, making sure I've not tangled it, I'll put the rod down. I always like, out of superstition, to have all my handles the same height. I can feel that's tight to the lead. Paying off line, paying off line, paying off line. Make sure the Velcro matches together. Clutch is in done, handles there. And the next thing we need to do is clip on the swinger. Swinger is clipped on as so. Now unfortunately that line will be very, very tight around the baited area. So what I do, I keep paying off line as so until I've got a bit of slack out there. That is ideal now. Clip the line into the clip. Make sure there's no line twist. I then have all three the same. Make sure that your clutch is tightened up to the right level so that when you get a take, line will pull off the clutch but you won't lose your rod. Also essential, make sure all three buzzers are on. All three handles set the same, all three clutches undone, and now I'm fishing and it's up to the carp. When using pop-ups, the last thing you want to do is break the centre of the skin of the pop-up by piercing it with a baiting needle. So obviously to hair the rig on, hair the bait on, the last thing you want to do is use a baiting needle. So instead of doing that, we tie what is known as a hair loop. All this is a simple grinner knot, 4 or 5 turns. We're using the Fox dental floss, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's your grinner knot. You then take your pop-up and slide that loop down round it. Quite fiddly to do at first, but with a bit of practice, the important bit is when you get to it tightening up against it. Find a flat area, tease it round, and pull tight. Now with that being a loop, a grinner knot loop, it cannot slacken, it can only tighten up. When you cast out bait out in the water, the pop-up will swell slightly, the knot will become tighter, and it will never ever come off. Okay James, are you sure we're going to miss this rain?
Oh yeah.
I can hardly hear myself talk. The weatherman promised me a hot, still, calm night. And look what I've got. I've got the monsoons coming here. I really hope that isn't a take. I hope that's just water on the line. You can never predict with carp fishing, and that's the beauty of carp fishing. I've set myself up in a swim on what I thought was the best information I had from the weather forecaster. Let's get that Ulrika back from Gladiators. She certainly did a better job than Michael Fish. I hope this rain stops. If it gets too cool, the fish will pull out of this area. It looks like a passing squall. I certainly hope so. If you look down close to the buzzers, see how effective that rod mat is. There's absolutely no splashback of mud, dirt or grime. All the water is trapped on the mat and the indicators are free to leap upwards. Let's keep my fingers crossed and hope a big one comes along tonight.
Luckily it's covered in weed, which might stop it scrapping so much, which is often a problem with these fish. As you can see, deep margins. Don't want it to go particularly to the right. Lots of weed on the bottom here as well. Still trying to get in that weed. I don't want it to do that. Unfortunately, it got covered in weed early on and has now realised it's time to fight again. Now, lots of people say they like to play carp for hours on end. I have to say, I like them in the net. That doesn't quite want to go in the net yet, and I don't want it to go in those pads either. And I don't want it to get in those pads because they're absolute sods. Even really good line like this XT, they will cut. Yes, it's in the net. Decent fish. Yes. Lovely fish. Yes, we got ourselves a, whoa, I think we're talking about a 20-pounder there. Lovely scattered mirror here. Before I start handling it, I'll get my hands nice and wet. They don't like the touch of warm hands upon them, so it's nice and wet. Just a nice covering of water. Make sure it doesn't go down the gills, you don't want to drown them. Just enough to wet them. Remember, they're out of their environment. About 18 pounds, no need to weigh this one, but what a beautiful fish. Look at those scales. Again, when you're holding fish up for photographs, keep them nice and low. The higher they are, the more likely they are to flip out of your hands. Keep them nice and firm, support their organs. Beautiful fish this. That's 18 and 19 pounds. Let's have a look at the other side as well. So it's worth, when you're photographing fish, keeping a record of both sides. Now this is a very distinctive fish, and you're probably not going to get two like this. Look at the colours there, yellow. Autumnal colours coming through there. He's not actually shed any bait. See how essential it is to have the landing net and the unhooking mat together. Stops it going anywhere. Again, nice and wet. Even got even got my kettle there for extra water. Again, look at that. Look at that. So he wants to shake free. Keep it nice and low, or her nice and low. What a lovely fish. About 18 pounds or so. Thank you very much. You've made my day. Isn't that a beauty? That's what we're doing it for. Nice and careful into water. Now then, bring your mum, or if he's a big male, your dad, and off it goes. Obviously this bit of rain has persuaded the carp that perhaps it was time to feed. It still wants to be in those pads. The clear water, of course, in the day doesn't help you with netting fish. In that your landing net stands out terribly. The carp can see it, can see you. It's still quite a strong fish. Weakening a bit now. I'm managing to turn it every time it gets towards the pads. Come on, in you go, and into the net. Well, we have a nice fish. And good double, possibly even a 20-pounder. Unfortunately, I'm going to be very wet on the way home to work. The important thing is, we didn't lose the fish. Nice fish. Good thing about these landing nets, you don't need to mess about. Over, clip. Landing net pole out of the way. We're ready to lift the back fish up to the unhooking mat. Oh, that's a nice fish. Nice mirror. See how important it is to have the net already here. Forceps, cutters if necessary. Let's see what we've got. Yep. A beautiful mirror. That's well hooked. You can see it's a pop-up and the fish is taking it into the back of the throat there. And what we need to do is use the forceps. Now, I've seen too many people try and wiggle hooks out without forceps. See how easy that was with forceps? Before you pull the lead from under a fish, always make sure you know exactly where it is. That line is still caught around the fish. The last thing we want to do is pull it, take a scale off the fish. There we go. Always be careful that you put your baited rig out the way. Got fish there, probably not quite as big as I first expected. I would expect that to be about 15 or 16 pound. It's a nice fish, beautiful condition. You can see how it's been grubbing along in the bottom there. Its mouth darkened, been caught once or twice before. In fact, it was hooked in the bottom lip not so long ago. Lovely condition fish, absolutely beautiful yellow colours there. Another nice fish and the end of a session. Again, it looks quite easy, doesn't it? I've done nothing different than you can do. Have a great time, hope you enjoyed it. See you soon.